All right. Good morning. You're all doing well. You have a handout that kind of summarizes where we've been. The Apostle Paul's. Too loud or the Apostle Paul has been teaching on some issues, some problems. And as you recall, the Corinthians would write Paul and say, now, Paul, we need to understand this issue. Well, now, Paul, we need to understand this issue. Well, now, Paul, we need to understand this. And Paul says, okay, let me answer that in one of my 3 letters. We only have 2 of them, probably 3, maybe 4. But what we've got is inspired and it is infallible and it teaches us things that even though we probably don't struggle with meat sacrifice to idols, we can learn principles that Paul has given to the local church there and giving to us in the universal church today. So he's talked about the attitude and the reality of meat sacrifice to idols and the fact that there are demons behind that. And so Paul says, I don't want you messing with that. So here's Paul giving very clear biblical, theological, and ethical instruction. And then we saw that Paul moved over to head coverings. I don't see any of the women wearing head coverings this week. I guess my teaching really wasn't very powerful. I guess I really didn't persuade anyone. Bob?
I noticed I was thinking last Sunday, that we don't observe head coverings outside the church except for mosques. So it really isn't in our culture, and it was in the culture at that time. So I wonder if that makes any difference.
Well, the act of a head covering is one thing, but the attitude that Paul was dealing with, I think, is universal for the church of Corinth, the church of Dallas, Texas, any time or season, and that is the issue of respect, submission, whatever. Now, whether it's a head covering or not, I don't care. I'm not sure where to go with that. But that's an interesting cultural reality. And so today, Paul's going to bring up another cultural reality, and that has to do with the Lord's Supper. But you say, well, how does that have to do with cultural reality? Well, a great deal. Because everything we have in the Bible is contained inside of a container, right? The contents is inside of the container, and the container is the culture. And so if we don't understand the culture of their day, we're not going to understand what the text meant in their day, and then we aren't going to be able to apply the text in our day. So we have to clearly understand that. Now, we're in a larger section of Paul's letter, and as you can see in red, he begins with men and women leading in worship. And he's going to end the section with men and women in worship, and specifically talking about how women are to dress, but in the end, how women are to speak. And in between that, he's going to talk about the order in worship, but right in the middle, the fact we all have gifts is key, but right in the middle is that long section we all know is the love chapter. So you can see Paul has a very purposeful structure in mind when he's going to write to the Corinthians. He's answering their questions. That's true. But he's also doing it in a very artistic way that they might hopefully be able to remember, because he didn't have email, he didn't have copy machines, so it's hard to remember everything. So this is the way that when they had the letter read to them, and they heard it, they would hopefully be able to retain a little bit more. Jason's reminded us that you're going to forget 90% of what he has said. I told him that you only forget 70% of what I say. So, whatever. At any rate, it is true, we forget a lot. So Paul, using a variety of cultural conveniences of language and articulation, he's trying to help them remember. So, but it's more than that. It's the fact that love is the key issue. Love is a key issue in dealing with one another. And the Corinthians weren't being very loving. So, kind of narrowing that down, we saw last week that Paul uses that idea of praise. And last time you talked about, hey, I will praise you because you're seemingly doing okay. And you're listening to the traditions and the practices in the church. But today he's going to say, but now I can't praise you. I can't praise you for what I'm getting ready to talk about because you're selfish at the Lord's Supper. And he's going to give them instruction. And later he's going to give them even more instruction. And this is what pastors do. They give instruction. So for Paul, it's, listen, I will not praise you in this issue that he's talking about. And at the conclusion, he'll say it again, I will not praise you. So the Apostle Paul knew how to praise people, and he knew how to not praise people. And it all surfaced because of the issue of instruction. They would listen to some traditions and authoritative teachings of Paul, but other things they wouldn't listen to what the instructions were, and therefore Paul says, I can't praise you. What Paul is doing is he's engaging in what every pastor should do. He is teaching the Bible. In this case, he's speaking it. We're teaching his, he's speaking it, but he's teaching the Bible. He then is drawing theological conclusion, and then he's reflecting that in ethical decisions that need to be made. And I take it, it doesn't take much to realize in our day and age, there are a lot of ethical issues out there. And underneath each one of those ethical issues is a theological construct. And beneath each one of those theological constructs is built upon the exposition of the Bible. So we do expositional teaching of the Bible, step one. We then want to pull together, well, what's the theological truth, step two. And then we figure out how do we apply that in the 21st century. Even though Paul's writing in the first century, the issues may be a little different, but the principles are transcultural. And that's what we want to bring over. So no, we're not bringing over wearing a physical head covering, but we are bringing over the principle. So in this case, Paul's going to bring us to another issue that's on tap. And the problem for this church was one of division. This is not new. It started in chapter 1. They were divided. And Paul's going to give a principle of unity. Now, we've seen this before in Paul in a number of his letters, but we see it quite a bit here in the book of 1 Corinthians. So the Corinthian situation, real simple. The people were schizoid, right? They were divided. I mean, we see that as a mental health issue, right? That's in the papers, everybody's worried about mental health, and we should be. There are issues of mental health. But the mental health problem here, Paul is saying, this isn't really a mental health problem. This is an attitude problem. This is a sin problem. This is an arrogance problem. You're divided. And the reason was the people were simply selfish. They were carnal. Well, he brought that up back in chapter 3, didn't he? That they were carnally minded. So let's take a look at chapter 11. In verse 17, Paul says, but in giving this instruction. Now, some translations say in giving this next instruction. The word next isn't there. They're interpreting that to mean he's looking forward to the next piece of material. I think that's probably true. But in giving this next piece of instruction, or in giving this instruction, I do not praise you. Well, that'll get their attention. He just said, I do praise you for this, but here we go, I don't praise you. Why? Well, because you come together not for the better. Here's the church. You come together for the church. But when you come together as a church, you come together, but it's not for the better. You come together, but it's not for the better, but it's for the worse. Can you imagine a pastor saying this to his church? I mean, he'd lose his job. Didn't matter. Paul wasn't paid, so he didn't worry about it. But actually, Paul was instructed by God, so he didn't worry about what people said. If you fear God, you're not going to really be afraid of human beings, right? But unfortunately, that's not quite how it operates in the American church, because churches unfortunately become a business, and so we have to keep the customers happy, and you do whatever you do. Paul said, I'm not worried about my customers. I got to speak it the way it is. Well, why is that? Well, look at verse 18. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, okay, so this is the church coming together. Earlier, it was all about the church service and the women there with the head coverings, but now he's on to the same, not topic, but the same situation when the church comes together. For in the first place, when the church, when you come together as church, I hear that divisions exist among you. And in part, I believe it. Paul had witness, he had testimony. Some people had told him a number of things, what was going on in the church. And Paul says, and by God, I believe it. He's already told us that in chapter 1 that they had division. He says in verse 19, for there must also be factions, interesting word, among you, in order that those who are approved may become manifested or evident among you. Therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in your eating, each one of you takes his own supper first, and one is hungry, and another is drunk. This church has a problem, right? So their problem is among them. So he talks about the you, and then he talks about among you. So he's trying to make it very clear, this is something that's going on inside this church in time, space, reality. And he's not praising them for it, and there's a problem with it, and part of it has to do with you're drunk at the Lord's Supper, which you can imagine isn't going to go over well with Paul. Now, in this passage, there are a number of problems. We're going to take a look at two issues. And as Quintilian reminds us, the goal of writing is not that you may be understood, but that you may not be misunderstood. So Paul does not want to be misunderstood. Sir?
I need help understanding the culture. I'm having a hard time imagining how you can get drunk at the Lord's Supper.
We're going to get there.
And they must do it differently than we do it now.
No, we're going to get there.
Okay.
Spurgeon reminds us the sermon is not simply a matter of telling the difference between what's right or wrong, rather it's a difference between right and almost right. Corinthians were not only, they weren't right, they weren't even almost right. They had a problem. Bob?
Yeah, I was listening to Dr. Jeffers the other day, and he recounted that Dr. Criswell's wife observed the elders were imbibing too much in the wine that they served for the Lord's Supper. They changed the wine to grape juice.
Yeah, they're the Baptists, you gotta keep it honest. Well, here's our first problem. Earlier in this book, Paul talked to the Corinthians about the fact that there were schisms, schizoids. There were quarrels. They were divided. Right? This is not news in this letter. So remember, the Corinthians are listening to somebody read this letter. So when Paul brings up the fact that there are factions among them, they're going, oh yeah, he's already harangued us about this before, hasn't he? He's used some pretty strong terminology on us. So here he says, yeah, there are these divisions. You're divided. But here he uses the word factions, which is actually the word for heresy. Division. Heresy. Now, we use that word in a very unique way these days, but Paul's using it in two ways. One, it can be specific and one, it can be general. I think here it might be a little more general because it's in the context of divisiveness, division, in the quarreling that's taking place within this church. So here we have a church that is schismatic. It's divided. It's got breaks in it. Now, many churches have division inside. Sometimes they're able to mask it, make it look pretty, but sometimes they don't, and it's all out war. Sometimes it's over age. Sometimes it's over worship style. Ooh, that's a little closer. Okay. Sometimes it's over whatever, right? Okay. It's not an issue of this is right, this is wrong. It's an issue of what I want, so to speak. Okay. But here, Paul is dealing with something that's a right and a wrong. And the problem here is these people are split apart, divided. They are involved in a divisiveness that is harming the church. Now, Paul's key word here is the Greek word, which we just transliterated into heresy. Heresy, dissension, division by a group who holds tenets distinct to it, or we sometimes talk about it as a sect, right? We talk about a school, a heretical movement, that type of thing. It's found in the New Testament quite a bit. And Paul says, listen, I believe it. Paul's kind of quoting maybe a diatribe phrase that he heard in his Greco-Roman world, but in part, I believe it. Now, we want to talk a little bit about divisiveness. There can be degrees of disagreement, right? Sure. There are all kinds of disagreement issues. A point of view that's not mine, you're disagreeing. Okay, we can do that. A false teacher, that's a little more serious. A heretic, a divider, factious man. Or maybe one step down would be an apostate. Someone who's heard the truth, understands the truth, rejects the truth, divides people over the vision of the issue. So when we talk about heresy, I guess sometimes it depends on the severity and the significance of the error, or the attitude, the action of the teacher, or the history of the interpretation. And that's usually what we associate the divisions over, right? Differing interpretations of the Bible. And by the way, most heretics, most Christian heretics are Christians. We're not talking about non-Christians, heretics. We're talking about Christians who believe something that's not historically true or something that's not biblically accurate. So we want to take a brief look at defining, describing, and showing the dangers of a heretic. One of my favorite books is called Making Heretics. And this is a guy's PhD thesis from Princeton Seminary, not the most conservative school in the universe, but it's looking at the heresy that took place in 1630, pre-colonial America. You know what that heresy was inside the church? Some people thought that you were saved by grace freely. And others said you have to do good work to prove you got saved. And so they argued over the doctrine of assurance, the doctrine of eternal security, and the doctrine of eternal rewards. Way back then in America. Well, not quite America, but pre-America. So what is a heretic, or who is an honest heretic? So Scott McKnight, he's going to suggest three ways that we can look at this term. First, he says there is the slipshod use. A heretic is used here for anyone who doesn't believe something we might think is important. Okay, and it's a little subjective, but I mean, you know that. You call, Mason's a heretic, man. Because we use it a little loosely. He's not a heretic, but you know. Second, there's an extended use. A heretic is used here for anyone who someone else thinks is skirting the danger on a central theological concept. So central theological doctrinal truths, they're going down the wrong road, the error-prone road, there's your heretic. So that's a little more, it just turned off. Anyway, that's your second kind of heretic. Third kind is what some call the proper use of a heretic. And Harold O.J. Brown, commonly called Joe, wrote a book called Heresy. And this is where you're basically contradicting what the historic Christian creeds have said, or the Christian councils have said. So he says, here's the rule on the proper use of the term heretic or heresy. Anything that denies Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea, or Chalcedon, the Council of Chalcedon, is heretical. Anything that affirms them is orthodox. We should learn to use the term for such affirmations or denials. Now, this is what Grace Bible Church does when it has things like responsive reading, when it has things like reciting the Apostolic Creed, minus certain sections in it that we find heretical. But this is a form of catechetical training. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a good thing. In fact, today, Jason's going to begin to talk about what we believe. And this is equipping us. So he's going to talk about the authority of the Bible. So there's nothing wrong with catechetical training. Nothing wrong with that. You may not like the methodology. That's fine. That's a matter of personal preference. But there's nothing wrong with going through some kind of, dare I say, system or mechanism whereby we learn what we believe. So we're going to do that with our doctrinal statement and teach through that. And that's a good thing. You may not like the responsive reading part of that. That's fine. You may not like the Apostles' Creed. That's fine. But some people do. Some people use that. So we basically, you either enjoy it or you don't, but that's okay. Be unified, because Paul would say, let's not be disunified. Now, we know that false teaching can come into the early church, or did come into the early church. It can come from the outside, like Peter said, or it can be inside the elder board. That's what Paul said. He was weeping with the elders the Ephesian elders in Acts 20 said, when I leave, I know that savage wolves will come in from among your very selves to harm the flock. So at least those are people from inside the church, but it may be people from inside the elder group that he was speaking to. And then, of course, there's other false teachers inside the church who actually Jesus reprimands them because this lady who wants to be the bishop of the church calls herself a prophetess, Jezebel. That's a bad name to call yourself. She probably didn't call herself that, but Jesus did. And he reprimands them because she's teaching my bondservants to commit acts of idolatry and immorality. Inside the church, by Jesus' own people. They were so led astray. In fact, being led astray, Peter and Barnabas were led astray, right? And Paul had to confront them face to face in Galatians 2. So we can see that false teaching, heretical teaching, bad teaching can be from outside the church, but can also be inside the church. In fact, in Titus, reject a factious man, a divider. It's the word heretic. Reject a heretic after a first and second warning, knowing that such a man is perverted and is sinning, being self-condemned. The New Testament is not shy in dealing with error. It's not shy in dealing with people who are in error. It is not shy about warning the church about those people. The job of the pastor is to feed, lead, and protect the flock. Sometimes you have to name names. Sometimes you have to tell people, folks, I know this person's become very well known and very famous, and you'll probably see their name and their books and whatever, and I need you to understand, this is a heretic. This teaching is heretical. This teaching is error. This teaching is dangerous. Please don't read that book, or wait till I write a white paper for you to read, to give you a critique of the book so you don't believe what that book says, because this book will not only take your money, it will harm your spiritual life. And that's what pastors are supposed to do, in my view. Direct, clear, not hateful, not trying to harm anybody, but protect the flock. And that's exactly what Paul is doing. So we must be aware in order to beware, right? Norm Geisler used to say that. We've got to be aware of what's going on so we can be wary of it. And that's what pastors do. That's what elders do. Because their job is to protect us. Okay? We're the sheep, they're the leadership, they're the pastors, the shepherds. They're supposed to protect us theologically and sociologically, because so much theology is wrapped up in the culture. So that's their job to do for us. Walter Lippmann, an old-time liberal, which meant he was a conservative by today's standards. Labels are very loading. There can be no liberty for a community which lacks the means by which to detect lies. He was talking about the political world, and imagine what he would think today instead of 1940s. But we can't even detect lies in our political world. We just think they're all lies. But in the church, we need to be able to detect lies, and the way Paul does that is by giving us truth and doctrine. So whether it's a creed, whether it's a council, whether it's an ecumenical letter, whatever it is, if it's biblical and if it helps us know what the truth is that we believe, then that's a good thing. And again, not everybody's going to like the same style, so to speak, and that's okay. So trafficking in the secular and trifling with the sacred. That is a description of the church of Corinth. That is a description of the church of the 21st century America. We just trifle. We just are not deep. And so we get led astray, unfortunately. Now, so Paul says, for there must be factions among you in order that, 19, those who are approved, word, we've seen this word before, may also become manifested among you. So, in chapter 3, Paul reminds us that each man's work will be manifested and then approved. Remember that? coming a day of evaluation. 1 Corinthians talks quite a bit about the idea of being approved. But approved by who? Well, obviously approved by God. A few weeks ago, we went over to 2 Corinthians in chapter 13 to spend a little bit of time looking at this concept as well. I'm not going to go over it again, but my point is, Paul is looking quite a bit at the issue of, will a Christian be approved or not approved? Now, we're not talking about approved to go to heaven. No, that's settled. That's justification. That's one act of faith receives the free gift of eternal life, and you're in the family, and that's a done deal. We're not talking about that. We're talking about growing and maturing in the Christian life. And in that, there will be approval and there will be disapproval. Now, that's a very serious concept, but only if you think about it. Most people don't think about it. But if you realize that your life has been given to you as a sacred trust by the King of Kings, and he wants you to be a divine imager, we're to represent him. We're to be conformed to his image. We're supposed to manifest Christ in a lost and dying world. Yes, even under government is somewhat problematic. We're supposed to be people who manifest Christ likeness. And one day we're going to come before the Lord. He's going to evaluate how we did. So again, we have to keep in mind, we're not talking about the decision of the great white throne, whether you go to heaven or hell. That's not what we're talking about. This is for the believer who is going to stand before the bema seat, the judgment seat of Christ, and be evaluated. And the Corinthians were not doing well. He says, that's why I can't praise you. I can't praise you in all of this. Because look what you're doing. You're dividing, you're harming, you're hurting. And Paul's already warned them in 1 Corinthians 3 and 4, and he warned them again in 2 Corinthians 5, 9, and 10, and 13 about this bema seat judgment, that when we go, we stand before the Lord, and he's going to evaluate everything we've done in our life. Everything, every word. Not about you, but that's troublesome, because sometimes my words aren't good. They're not right. They're not proper. And when I'm talking wrongly, it's because I'm not thinking correctly. I'm not thinking rightly. But if I keep my focus on that day and the fact that I'll stand before him, it tends to have a better outcome for me. This judgment seat idea, it's all over the New Testament. Unfortunately, we tend to not focus on it. I'm extremely happy that you remember Jason a number of sermons when he was talking about our mission. Did you remember he talked about our mission is that we would be found worthy at the judgment seat of Christ? Do you remember that terminology? Huh? It just warms my heart. I think that's wonderful because that is central. We're not talking about the Great Commission. I mean, yeah, that's the given. But the Great Commission, that's the given. But we are supposed to be doing that because one day we're going to give an account for what we have done. So the Great Commission is both what? Sharing the gospel and then developing people. We share to the lost, we share the life-giving message, and those who are saved, help them grow into the faith. Together, that's how you make a disciple. You win the lost, grow up the saved. Some people focus and have a gift and an ability more on the evangelistic side. And so Bob comes and tells us what he's doing, and half of us are going, gosh, that guy's got guts. I can't believe it. Not much of anything. Oh, you can go to hell. You want to know how to go to heaven? Yeah. But that's what we're all supposed to do. And then the other side is making disciples involves training and teaching. And one day we're going to stand before the Lord, and he's going to ask how we did. Not all Christians do well, unfortunately. So there's a difference between perseverance and preservation. God will preserve us to the end. We will get safely home. Absolutely. That's eternal security. But it may be a rough ride for some because not every Christian perseveres in their faith. They get led astray by the world and the flesh and the devil. They get sideways. And again, that's what church is for. To call us back, remind us of eternal truth, help us recalibrate who I am, where I am, what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, be encouraged by other Christians sharing testimonies and giving affirmation of what's God's doing in their life. And I go away with, okay, I'm going to have a better week. I feel like I'm closer with the Lord. I'm ready to roll. That's why you sing. That's why we why you fellowship. That's why you pray. That's why we meet. That's why we do this. So we can get back out there and get beat up and maybe get killed. But eternal security is attached, no problem. Temporal assurance depends on how you're living and how you're feeling. Eternal significance, now that's the key. That's your main signature. So my question's always been in this passage, why does God allow heresy? Why does he let these people do dumb things and become diviners and harm people? Why does he do that? Why allow it? Well, unbiblical principles are present so that biblical leaders are easily identifiable. That's one way. Right? If you're speaking the truth, it's easy. Oh, well, he's saying that, speaking that, doing that. I know where they're at, and I can look at that, and that seems to correspond with what Paul says, so I can identify. False teachings are a part of God's plan so that approved ones might become visible among you. It's a way of showing approval. Bad doctrine to make good workmen stand out. God allows mixed messages to amplify and clarify the voice of those committed to the text. And there's a lot of preachers out there that wouldn't know what the Bible is if you put it in their face. They don't teach from the Bible. They hold it, but they don't teach from it. They just kind of make it into some nice little saying, but they're not teaching the Bible, unfortunately. Dangerous doctrines can provide a clear contrast for competent leaders. And that's why I think we need to stand up and say, by the way, T.D. Jakes is a wonderful guy, I guess, and he does lots of great stuff, but his view of the Trinity is what we would call heretical. It is not orthodox. It is dangerous. Joyce Myers, I guess she's a nice person, but do not trust everything she says about her idea of the filling of the Spirit. It is heretical. It is dangerous. And you can go on and on and on. And when my name gets on that list, I'm in trouble. But until then. So assume the best in people, answer the issues from the Bible, recognize and reveal the truth, reject and rebuke the error, discern the truth, discard the error. This is how you deal with a situation and or a person when there's perhaps heresy, something that's dividing the church. Or you pray, and then you study, and then you pray some more, and then you study the answers you came up with from your study, and then you seek wisdom from others, and then you pray, and then you proceed with caution. So the danger is when we start throwing the heretic word around, and everybody's a heretic, and blah, 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 and we're not precise with it. We need to be a little bit precise. So we go slow, lay low, and don't go. Okay? It does not mean that you don't point things out. And it doesn't mean that you don't go find somebody and say, well, what do you think about this? I get phone calls almost every week from people who say, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about this person's teaching? What do you think about this book? I had a lady call me, she saw, I got this book, I'm reading it, it's really interesting, blah, blah, blah. I never heard the guy or book. So I got on the phone, checked them out, looked at a few things, call her back up. Jane, you really don't need to be reading that book. And here's 4 reasons why. And she said, I'll put that book away. Okay? I mean, that's part of my job. Okay? That's part of what I do, because I'm not a plumber. I can't fix houses. That's what Marcia does. I can't do the handy stuff. There's Robert back there. He does all that stuff. He's good at that. I can't. These hands are built for life. Nothing else. But we all have our function, right? We do what we do. So that's what I do. Bob.
In front of man, there is a limit, which is a relief, is that we typically in front of man, a really man, a heretic, once or twice, and then let him go.
Yeah, that's what Paul wrote to Titus, reject a factious man with 2 warnings and then get away from him.
We don't have to keep.
Exactly. We're not obligated to spend the next 20 years trying to fix them. We are obligated to say that is dangerous teaching. And he won't listen. I mean, I've sat down with a couple of people a couple of times with a group of people to confront them with some things they were teaching, and they would not listen. And so we don't go talk about that anymore. It's like a dead horse. So yeah, there's a time. Paul told us, at least he told Titus. Now we move into the second part, communion. So are we talking about commonism? They have all things in common, or communism? Of course not. Or communion. And how does communion work? Well, we have to understand that again, the sacred is wrapped up in the secular. What's going on in the church of Corinth is tying into what's going on in the city of Corinth. And of course, Paul is talking about when the church comes together for their meal, for their supper, for their time of communion. Here's a modern day communion table. Einstein says, it's become the obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. So this is not what we do at the Lord's Supper. This shouldn't be what you do at your dining room table either. But it is what a lot of people do. So we won't talk about the Lord's Supper and communion, and we're not going to talk about all of it today because we can't. We are going to talk about a bit. Let me read the bit we want to talk about. He says, verse 20, therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in your eating, each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry, and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you. That sounds very serious to me. So the Lord's Supper should accent and intensify group solidarity. The Corinthian Supper accented and intensified social differences. No one ought to feel humiliated at the Lord's Supper, yet the Corinthians' manner of conducting the meal left the have-nots feeling they were beneath the notice of their fellow Christians. The primary issue is their conduct surrounding the Lord's Supper, and Paul appeals to the Last Supper tradition to correct it. So we need to understand that this spiritual discussion is taking place in the midst of a cultural discussion. So we have to ask a couple of questions. What was eaten? Where was it eaten? And who ate it? Right? Because that's part of the cultural background, both secular and spiritual. So from the secular standpoint, there were common rules at banquets and meal parties. So you have injunctions against quarreling and fighting. That might apply. Injunctions against taking the assigned place of another. Special seating. High-level people here, lower-level people there. Injunctions against speaking out of turn or without permission. Injunctions against fomenting factions. Injunctions against accusing a fellow member before a public court. Specifications for trials with the club for inter-club disputes. You get the idea. They had order, so to speak. Sometimes people broke the order. So I'm going to go through some of these. There are all kinds of interesting protocols that were lined up. So when was this meal eaten? Well, the Corinthians church was composed of well-to-do people, and the time of the arrival would differ. The well-to-do would come early, the slaves would arrive late, the latecomers would doubtless find no place to be besides the atrium of the house and would be entering hungrily and seeing where others had already reached the point of safety. So some come early, some come late. Those who come early eat everything, drink everything. Those who come late, you go out here where it's not quite as nice, and you get whatever's left. This is a potluck gone bad, right? You got there late to the potluck, and everybody didn't bring enough stuff, or everybody ate too much of it. So where did they eat? Well, they had different places. They had different rules for how many people should be there. You know, maybe 9 would be in this area, but the bulk of people would be out here. Obviously, when you go to a party, right, you want to be closer to the host. You want to be in the better room. You want to be in the right place. You want to, right? I mean, that's kind of what we do. And Paul is saying that's what the culture does, but that's not what the church should be doing. The wealthy would come early, join the host in the dining room for the best food and drink. By the time the slaves gathered in the atrium for the meager amount that they brought or what was left, the early arrivals would be in their cups. Okay. What was eaten? Oh, this is fun. Okay. But we don't have, well, we have time. Plutarch describes a banquet at which guests brought their individual meals and complains that this resulted in many banquets and the destruction of fellowship. He says, quote, where each guest has his own private portion, fellowship perishes. 1 Corinthians 11:21 indicates that this was part of the problem in Corinth. Each goes ahead with his own meal. Various members brought their own food and consumed it on their own schedule. Second, there was a Roman custom to serve different types of food to different categories of guests. Juvenal tells us a little bit how this took place. You're given a wine that even, and I don't know what this word means, pollutus would not take. But your host drinks vintage wine, bottled, counsels, or long hair and beards. You're served bread, which can scarcely break a hard lump of dough already spread with mold, impervious to teeth, and sure to crack your jaws. But a loaf made out of fine flour, snow white and soft as gauze, is served your host. Look at the mammoth lobster with garnish and asparagus being served your host. For you, a shrimp is served in state. One shrimp will float on a half of an egg in a tiny plate. I want to get there early. Look, that half-eaten hair they'll give us now, or from the haunch of or some bits. We'll get what's left of the capon soon. So all you sit in silence, ready, the bread held tight, untasted, and wait. So the rich would come and they get the best, the poor would come late, they get the worst. And this practice, I'm quoting you a bunch of stuff because it's almost hysterical how the social life was. It was arrogant, prideful, boastful, hubris area that people would come to and they want to have the power and have the right people with them. And Paul says, no, I can't praise you for acting like pagans. I can't deal with you and say this is good in the church when you come together. It's not good when you come together because it's not the Lord's Supper, it's your supper. And Paul says this is not the way it should be. So they would come for supper. This is kind of the main meal late in the afternoon. It's not the early breakfast, it's not the snack, it's the main meal late in the afternoon. But if you're a hard worker, a slave, you don't get off, you got to come late and you miss out on the food. So Paul, as you noticed when I read it, he seems to have these 5 questions, more like an indictment. And then he issues the conclusion about this, I do not praise you. So Paul is kind of bothered with these people. They're dividing, they're harming. They're, in fact, he uses the word despising. They're looking down on people of the church. This is not what's supposed to be. So, as David Garland puts it, he says, they cannot label it the Lord's Supper, he says, when they come together and act like this. It's their supper, not the Lord's. It's not the Lord's dinner, because the Lord's dinner is intended to convey to every participant that he or she is somebody precious to God. The Corinthians meal communicated to some that they were worthless nobodies. It was tainted by the deadly combination of indulgence and indifference. This self-devouring of their own food contrasts with Jesus taking bread. Both take, the Corinthians take on their own behalf. Jesus takes on behalf of others. The Corinthians act selfishly. Jesus acts unselfishly in giving his life for others. So this wasn't the Lord's Supper. This happened to be their supper. For the poor, the formal meal was had only for special occasions, sponsored by a civic benefactor or a benefactor of some other kind. Thus, the regular Christian community meal would have had far greater significance than the meal would among the wealthy. Paul must be addressing those who have houses to eat in and presumably are heads of household. They also have food to consume. They possess enough status to despise and treat with contempt and shame those who are the have-nots. Can you imagine this church acting this way? Can you imagine having a church potluck here at Grace? I don't know if you've been here long enough, but many, many, many years ago, every Wednesday night, there was the church dinner. And people came early and came late, and they'd come dressed up, and they'd come in work clothes or coats and ties. In those days, a lot of guys had starch shirts and stuff. But everybody got there, and all the kids got there, and everybody went not for a food fight, but a fight over the food, but to get it all and serve it up. And they'd sit at tables, and there was crosstalk and dialogue and fun, and then they'd break, and everybody go off to Awanas and the choir practice. And I think Alan Ross would teach a Bible study. They'd have a counseling training session. They had a variety of things at the church. And that was very unique, it seemed to me. It was very unique. It was actually a good thing. Now, it was hard to get young kids, Marcia's trying to get kids in there and all that stuff, so it wasn't as fun for her. But for me, it was fun. It was a great time, and there was no superiority, elevation, all that kind of stuff. It was community, right? They had all things in common. It wasn't communism. It was an attitude of we're all the same. Yeah, you're rich, I'm not, but we're all the same because we're eating the same meal, we're talking and having fun and laughing. Corinthians were doing that. They had a big problem. Well, anyway. So the church is to manifest theological equality, right? We're all one in Christ, not sociological equity. This is not advocating that, well, every Christian has to have the same amount of money. Every Christian has to have 2 cars and 1 boat and 1 plane. No, we're not saying that. We're not looking for equity, because the Bible doesn't really say that. But it does talk about theological equality, right? Neither Jew nor slave, or neither Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, all are one in Christ, right? We all are justified the same way. We're all part of the body of Christ the same way. However, there are differences, but those differences sociologically are not supposed to show up at the Lord's Supper. All of that should be put away. It wasn't put away in the non-Christian world, but in the church, there's not only theological equality, there is sociological love. And the Corinthians didn't have it. And Paul is chiding them for it. So they were contaminated by their culture. That's what happened. And guess what? We can become contaminated by our culture. So as I look at our church, we have a great opportunity. We have old and young. We have older and older and younger. We have a wide band there. We have a wide band of sociological affinities. And those can either be things that pull us apart or those can be things that pull us together. Now, Paul's going to go on next time and talk about more of the theological aspect of the Lord's Supper, but he's going to still connect it to this problem. And this problem was simple, because we're very simple: selfishness. The church was selfish. They were carnal. They started out in chapter 1 and 2 being divided and having quarrels, and they end up here having heresies and divisions among them. And Paul is chiding them as a good pastor should. So our goal, hopefully, is that we can manifest the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. We can be those who help provide a coagulation of the body here, right? Now, how do we do that? Well, one simple way is, and I'm not saying I do this all the time, but when's the last time we went up to somebody here who looks to be a stranger and welcomed them, right? Now, so we have greeters. Mason does that. Mason's the guy. He's my proxy. He greets everybody. He likes everybody. So he's meeting everybody. Okay, that's good, but he's paid to be good. He's not really paid, but he just kind of does it. But all of us, in one sense, are greeters of people of the church, whether it's greeting new people here in our class or greeting people out there, right? We all need to be involved in it. So hopefully we can do that, and hopefully there's not a sociological distinction that keeps us from doing that. I walk in here, not in here, I walk in the church, I get my handouts, they're there, they usually are, and that's good, and I walk down, and I see a man sitting in a chair who obviously is older, has some physiological issues and difficulties, and obviously the church is a place of importance for him. Part of it's sociological, I hope some of it is spiritual. And sometimes I see him alone, and then sometimes I see him talking with a number of people. And he's talking with the kinds of people that you wouldn't think would be naturally connected to talk with him. And that's a good thing. Because our people, us, are reaching out to people. And that's something I think we can all do. Now, we all get stuck because, well, we're here, we know who we know, we don't know the other people, let's just stay in our group, stay in our lane. So my challenge would be, well, try to break out, be a little more like Mason, greet people, say hi to somebody you don't know. They're not going to reject you, so you don't have to worry about that. You may only say 3 words and then they're done, and that's fine. But it might be that that person right then is on the verge of cracking up. And they're just here because they don't know what else to do. And they're wondering if it's going to make any difference. And we can be the people who help make a difference. So, all right. Let's pray. Father, help us take your word and do something with it. Lord, help us take your word and apply it in our life by not being selfish, by being inclusive and encouraging, and being brave to do that even with people we don't know. So Lord, help us be known as people and a church that are friendly and welcoming, and that that's not just a slogan, but that it's true. And Lord, protect us from division and divisiveness in our church. We pray for the doctrine to be true. We pray for us to know it. Help us to make time to study it. And Lord, help us to be aware. Help us to be insightful. And help us submit to the ministry of your Spirit who illuminates truth to us.